Okay, let's unpack this. When you look at historical figures, especially ones as influential and, well, deeply complex as Malcolm X, you quickly realize there isn't just one simple story.
No, definitely not.
You often find multiple narratives woven together, sometimes agreeing, sometimes sharply contradicting each other.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the fascinating space we're diving into today, guided by this stack of sources you've shared with us that offer, different windows into his life and specifically the enduring questions around his assassination.
That's right. And look, this isn't really about settling the debate definitively today.
No.
It's more about exploring the different claims, the interpretations, the pieces of evidence that are presented within these particular documents we have here.
Got it.
Our mission really is to help you understand what's in this specific stack and what insights we can maybe pull from it.
Okay, so what is in the stack? We've got an academic journal article, you said, one that dives deep into how different biographers have portrayed Malcolm X.
Yeah, and it particularly critiques some of the more, let's say, controversial personal claims made about him.
Right. And well,
We also have materials related to the official aftermath of his death, essentially a guide to thousands of pages of transcripts from the official assassination trial.
Wow. Okay, so that gives us a look at the evidence presented and the legal process back then.
Exactly. A window into that official record.
And for a sense of the immediate context, the broader political landscape at the time.
For that, we have a declassified CIA document, interesting in itself, that touches on international reactions, and also a scanned copy of the militant newspaper from the week right after his assassination.
Ah, okay, so that captures how his death and his ideas were being discussed, like in that very moment.
Precisely. So
Yeah.
let's jump in and see what these sources start to reveal.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So starting with those contested narratives you mentioned, the ones found in biographies, this journal article you brought, it takes a really critical look, doesn't it, at how biographers construct their stories of Malcolm X.
It does.
And it focuses heavily on challenges to certain kind of personal claims.
Yeah, it highlights, for instance, accusations made in books like Manning Marable's Biography, claims that touched on incredibly sensitive aspects of his personal life.
Like what specifically?
Well, including suggestions of homosexuality and also alleged unfaithfulness to his wife, Betty Shabazz, with various women.
Right.
The article notes Marable actually drew on earlier claims by another biographer, Bruce Perry, for some of this.
Okay. And what's striking, as the article seems to point out, is how Marable presents some of these claims.
Yeah.
Like the one about a UN secretary.
Right. The Fifi example in Geneva. Marable interpreted a diary entry where Malcolm X noted Fifi came to his room for a couple of hours in the evening.
Okay.
And Marable suggested this implied, quote, a more intimate involvement.
But the journal article pushes back on that.
It pushes back hard.
Yes.
Yeah, it argues that interpreting that diary entry as, like, clear evidence of intimacy is a real leap.
Why? What's the reasoning?
Well, a few things. First, Malcolm X carried that diary, intending to publish it, and he knew Betty might see it. So the article asks, would he likely include really incriminating details? Probably not.
Fair point.
Plus, the article notes that after Fifi left, Malcolm wrote in that same diary that he went for a walk feeling alone and feeling lonely, thinking of Betty. As the author says, that's not typically what you write after an intimate encounter. It sounds more like a lonely business traveler.
Yeah, that context definitely changes the feel of it. That's a powerful counter-argument from the source. What about the other claims, like the one about the young OAAU secretary?
Sharon's 6X pool. The article critiques Marable's claim about a secretly involved and illicit sexual affair with her, an 18-year-old, which Marable apparently claimed continued right up until Malcolm's death.
And what does the article highlight about that specific claim?
It really calls out Marable for even suggesting, and this is a direct quote from the source, without an atom of evidence to support his claim, that Sharon 6X might have been in Malcolm's hotel room the night before he was assassinated.
Wow. Without an atom of evidence.
Yeah. It illustrates a key critique in the article, that some of these really damaging biographical claims are presented with very little or sometimes no verifiable evidence. They might be relying on speculation or, unverified accounts.
And the article points out why these specific claims about infidelity are so significant, right? It's not just gossip.
Exactly, because they could imply Malcolm X was a hypocrite.
Right, particularly given his very public split with Elijah Muhammad over his adultery and being involved in a lawsuit against him because of it.
Precisely. So these biographical claims, they aren't just about his private life. They have major implications for his public persona, his integrity.
So the journal author really disputes the foundation for these claims.
Strongly, suggesting Marable and Perry before him may have gullibly reported allegations where, memories fade and gossip. Well, gossip just remains untrue.
Mm-hmm.
The article also contrasts this with Malcolm's own words in his autobiography, dedicating it to his beloved Betty, stating she was the only woman I ever thought about loving, and one of only 4 women he ever trusted.
And didn't the article mention his family's view, too?
It did. It includes the recollections of Betty and her older daughters, who remembered him as a warm, loving, and devoted husband and father.
So it's like you have these biographical claims on one side, rooted in maybe interpretations or specific alleged sources,
Right.
and then these counter-arguments from the journal article, drawing on contradictory evidence, logic about the source material like the diary, and testimony from his own family.
Yeah, it really shows how history isn't just, a set of agreed-upon facts. It's dynamic. It's interpretation, claim, counterclaim, even decades later. Looking at how biographers approach someone's life and how others critique their methods, their evidence, it gives you a richer, maybe more complicated, but definitely a deeper understanding of how historical narratives get built.
It forces you, the listener, to ask, okay, what's the basis for this claim? Who's saying it? What evidence actually contradicts it?
Exactly, that critical lens.
That's a crucial takeaway, the importance of looking behind the narrative. Okay, so shifting focus now from these biographical debates, let's turn to the official record, the record related to his death.
Right. So Malcolm X was assassinated February 21st, 1965. Audubon Ballroom, speaking to his OAAU organization.
Now, what followed was a trial focused on 3 men.
That's right. Thomas Hagen, Thomas 15X Johnson, and Norman 3X Butler, all members of the Nation of Islam.
Which, the source notes, had indeed vowed revenge after Malcolm X left the group.
Yes, that context is important.
So this trial guide you provided, it takes us inside that official process. What was the initial situation at the trial?
Well, initially, all 3 defendants maintained their innocence. They had pretty weak alibis, apparently. Hagen, though, he was actually apprehended right there at the scene.
Okay.
And the source mentions evidence like a .45 clip found on him, and get this, his thumbnail being found on a diversionary smoke bomb that was used during the attack.
Wow, okay. Pretty specific evidence linking him to the scene.
Yeah. Then the guide describes a really significant turning point. Hagen takes the stand.
And confesses.
Well, sort of. While still maintaining he wasn't one of the guys who actually fired the fatal shots, he did confess to his own role in the broader conspiracy.
Okay.
But crucially, the source says he did this primarily to try and exonerate the other 2, Johnson and Butler.
So it was an incomplete confession designed to protect others.
That's how the source characterizes it, yes. Designed to shield others who were potentially involved but maybe not caught.
So how did that play out? Despite the complexities of his testimony, and I guess the prosecution trying to argue he was just muddying the waters?
Right, trying to confuse the jury.
What was the outcome?
The outcome of the trial was that all 3 men, Hagen, Johnson, and Butler, were found guilty of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison.
So that was the official verdict, based on the evidence presented in court at that time.
That was the official verdict. But, and here's where the story gets much more complicated, according to the source material.
Okay.
Hagen later, much later, in 1979, provided sworn affidavits, legal documents.
Giving more details.
A much fuller account, yeah. In these affidavits, he stated plainly that the assassination was carried out by 5 members of the Newark NOI Mosque, and he reiterated again that Johnson and Butler were completely innocent.
Wow. So the convicted assassin himself says the other 2 guys convicted with him were innocent.
Yes. And the guide notes a really critical detail here.
What's that?
The courts refused to consider this new evidence from Hagen.
Refused. Even though it was from one of the convicted men.
That's what the guide states. They wouldn't reopen the case based on these affidavits. And so Johnson and Butler, the 2 men Hagen maintained, were innocent. They served out their sentences.
That's pretty staggering.
It really is. And this contrast, between the official trial outcome and Hagen's later unconsidered testimony, it highlights a major question mark that has just persisted around the assassination.
I can see why.
The guide does mention that Hagen's later revelations reportedly kind of quieted some of the alternative theories that had circulated over the years, theories involving the FBI, CIA, NYPD, even drug cartels.
Though those theories obviously had various roots and levels of support themselves.
Of course. But Hagen, pointing specifically to the Newark NOI members, shifted the focus for many.
And the trial records themselves, the guide says they're extensive.
Oh, massive. Thousands of pages. Testimony, witness interviews, names like Abe Bay, Earl Grant 5X are mentioned as examples notes from the DA's office, grand jury proceedings.
Physical evidence, too.
Yep. Ballistic reports on bullet fragments, the Colt .45, even the sock used in the smoke bomb. Photos of that evidence. FBI photos of Malcolm's recovered red diary, which, sidebar, was actually stolen from a court vault at one point before being returned to the family years later.
Good grief. What a story in itself.
Isn't it? And the records even include documents related to later appeals and Malcolm X's earlier eviction trial from 1964.
So what these records give you as a researcher or just someone interested is direct access to the official narrative.
Right.
How it was constructed and presented in court.
Exactly. But understanding Hagen's later confession and the crucial fact that it wasn't formally considered by the courts, well, that's essential for seeing the unresolved questions.
Yeah.
It makes you recognize that the legal conclusion wasn't necessarily the full story, even according to one of the men convicted.
Yeah.
It shows you the layers of complexity that exist even within seemingly straightforward official historical documents.
It really makes you think deeply about what constitutes official history. And maybe more importantly, what gets left out or ignored.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears again. Let's step into the immediate political moment of his assassination. Using the militant newspaper and that CIA doc to get a sense of the context, the reactions.
Right, and the militant editorial, published literally days after his death, offers a really powerful perspective.
How so?
It portrays Malcolm X not just as, the civil rights leader, but as this fearless, uncompromising, incorruptible figure who was deeply feared by America's racist rulers.
Feared? Why feared?
Because according to the editorial, he wanted to transform the Negro Revolution, as they called it then, into a real revolution, one aimed at the total destruction of racial injustice in America.
You can see in the paper how his international stature was growing, right? And the admiration he commanded in black communities for his courage and eloquence.
Absolutely. And the paper includes some really stark reactions from figures who knew him or commented right after his death.
Like who?
Like his wife, Betty Shabazz, her reaction is just heartbreakingly captured, expressing frustration that the police and press had been so unfair to him, not believing him even after their home was firebombed.
Yeah.
And then predicting almost bitterly that they would now claim he somehow shot himself. Just devastating.
And others, like James Baldwin.
Yeah, author James Baldwin is quoted, linking the killing directly to the crucible of the Western world and the whole legacy of white supremacy. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher in England, voices concern about American violence, fearing it would become the violence of the world.
So immediate, strong reactions.
And significant international reactions, too, noted in both the militant and that CIA document. The All-African Trade Union Federation, various African nationalist parties, they accused American imperialists.
Okay.
The militant even reported Shirley Graham Du Bois suggesting the assassination bears all the markings of a Central Intelligence Agency execution.
Wow, so those kinds of theories were circulating immediately.
Immediately and internationally. These weren't just internal American reactions. His death was instantly seen by many around the globe through the lens of anti-imperialist and anti-racist struggles. Chinese and Cuban newspapers called it a racist crime.
What's also incredibly valuable in that issue of the militant, you said, are excerpts from interviews with Malcolm X himself from right before his death.
Yes, and they really show his evolving and I'd say increasingly radical political thought in those final months.
Like what kind of things was he saying?
Well, he talked about crime in prison not just as individual failings, but as forms of individual rebellion against a rotten society. That's a quote. He defined revolutions not as seeking compromise or begging, but as completely overturning corrupt systems. He was unflinching. He stated that the U.S. system, which he said still colonized and enslaved 22 million African Americans, was the most corrupt, most criminal system on earth.
The strong words. And his views on capitalism and racism.
Very pointed. He argued it was basically impossible for a white capitalist not to be racist. He saw capitalism itself as predatory, like a vulture needing blood to suck, preying on the helpless, and he predicted its collapse as nations around the world freed themselves.
And he was rethinking black nationalism too, wasn't he?
He was. He spoke about redefining it. Apparently, after meeting the Algerian ambassador who was white but a revolutionary fighting exploitation, Malcolm realized that defining his objective only by race could actually alienate potential allies.
Interesting.
So he broadened his goal. It became overturning the entire system of exploitation by any means necessary, alongside other revolutionaries, regardless of their race.
That's a significant shift. He also criticized the U.S. government pretty harshly.
Oh, yeah. For its inaction on civil rights issues right here at home, Mississippi, Alabama, while at the same time intervening militarily in places like Vietnam and the Congo. He saw these as connected struggles, oppressed people facing the same forces globally.
And he wasn't letting the Democratic Party off the hook either.
Not at all. Despite overwhelming black support for the Democrats in '64, he pointed out their failure to seat the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegation at the convention. Actions or inactions spoke louder than words for him.
Right.
He also recognized, kind of strategically, that the black Muslim movement's earlier militancy had actually pushed other, more mainstream civil rights groups to become more assertive themselves.
And his own organization, the OAU, why non-religious?
He formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, the OAU, specifically as a non-religious group because he came to understand that the fundamental issues facing black people in America were rooted in being in a racist society controlled by racists from top to bottom.
A political and social problem, not just religion.
Exactly. A problem beyond religion, as he put it, for many black people he wanted to reach.
So reading those interviews right alongside the newspaper's reports on his death and all the other stuff happening, Selma, student protests, police frame-up accusation.
It's full context.
It gives you this incredibly vivid sense of the volatile, high-stakes political climate he was operating in. And the truly radical direction his own thinking was taking just before he was killed. It really captures the urgency of that specific moment.
It really does. It's like stepping back in time, hearing his voice, seeing the world he inhabited through the lens of a contemporary publication from that exact week.
Okay. So pulling back now from this deep dive through your sources, we've looked at how biographies grapple with his personal life, right? Examining both the controversial claims and the counter-evidence presented in that journal article.
We've explored the official record of his assassination trial, understanding the verdict based on the evidence presented in court, but also highlighting the profound questions raised by that later confession from Hagen, the one the courts chose not to address.
Yeah, that's a big one. And we've immersed ourselves in the immediate aftermath using the militant newspaper and the CIA document to see the sheer range of reactions to his death and to understand his own radical political voice as he was articulating it in his final months, all against that backdrop of a world really in turmoil.
And these sources, sometimes offering differing details or perspectives, they collectively reinforce that the story of Malcolm X is just not a simple, single narrative. It can't be.
No.
It's a history marked by contested claims about his life, unresolved questions surrounding his death, and the enduring legacy of a figure who held profoundly different meanings for different people during a really critical turning point in history.
It definitely leaves you thinking, what does it mean for our understanding of history when key facts or significant alternative accounts like Hagen's remain disputed or aren't fully addressed by the official records?
Right.
And how does engaging with multiple sources, even ones that clash, help us navigate that complexity and maybe get closer to a more nuanced, if not fully settled, understanding of the past?
Something to consider.
Definitely something for you, our listener, to consider as you reflect on what we've unpacked today.